So I am Sandra, and this is my colleague Anna. And in this presentation, we will talk about nominal classification systems, like gender, noun classes, and classifiers. And yesterday, for those who were in the workshop on disentangling contact and inheritance, the discussion touched upon the circumstances under which these kinds of systems can be lost and retained. So here we'll be offering one perspective to that question. Nominal classification systems have been accused of various things, like being arbitrary or redundant, for instance. Like in this quote by Hjortdal, where he likens them to linguistic male nipples. Or in this quote by Jespersen, where he refers to Indo-European gender systems as a chaos without governing principles. But despite this, nominal classification systems are really widespread in the world's languages, and slightly more than half have at least one kind. So on this map, this is represented by all the colors except gray. And they're spread out across all continents, across numerous phylogenetic groups. And on the flip side, these statistics also mean that 47% of the world's languages lack nominal classification systems altogether. So a lingering question in the study of nominal classification is, why have it at all? Why do so many languages have a system where the nominal lexicon is categorized and needs to be marked in the grammar? And these kinds of systems do indeed come with a number of disadvantages. So as we already saw, they can be called redundant and arbitrary in some sense. They also come with quite a heavy cognitive load, which makes them difficult to learn and maintain. So in first language acquisition, for instance, large classifier systems are not mastered fully until puberty. And perhaps especially in second language acquisition, nominal classification systems are notoriously difficult to learn. So this begs the question, if nominal classification systems are so unnecessarily taxing, why do roughly half of the world's languages have them? And that's what we'll be investigating in this talk. We'll begin by introducing nominal classification as a phenomenon, and then we'll present the current state of research on prediction in nominal classification systems, showing one of the reasons why they are useful from a language processing perspective. And we'll then proceed to discuss why not every language has one, if they are, after all, so cognitively useful. And here we'll talk about speaker and listener trade-offs and how they shape languages. So in this final section, we'll take a bit of an exploratory approach and present a preliminary study. So by nominal classification systems, we mean grammatical systems that divide the nouns of a language into categories, including subtypes such as gender, noun classes, and classifiers. These systems always have some kind of semantic basis, which can be more or less transparent. And there is a striking unity in the kinds of semantic parameters that these systems are based on, often animacy and physical properties. And here is just a little bit of data from GramBank, which has 4 different features relating to nominal classification, semantics specifically, animacy, sex, shape, and plant status, and we can see the number of languages in the database that has each kind. So we've already seen that nominal classification systems have some drawbacks. However, they also have plenty of well-documented advantages and functions. They can mark constituency through agreement. They can be used for individuating countable reference. They can contribute to lexical expansion by being used as derivational devices. They can be used for reference tracking purposes at the discourse level, and they can facilitate language processing by being used predictively. So now we will focus a bit on their predictive advantage.
And first, we would like to take you through what we mean when we talk about predictive processing. So if you hear the word stainless, what do you think the next word will be? I got that one too. So within the framework of predictive coding, the brain is thought to keep a model of the world which continuously generates predictions about upcoming sensory input, such as words or their meanings, before they've been activated by the bottom-up signal. Even when the input is coarse-grained and we cannot make exact lexical predictions, we can estimate certain features. For instance, the French definite article la tells us that the following noun is feminine. And in a similar way, the Baniwa classifier ka, which is used with curvilinear reference, allows the listener to pre-activate reference that take that classifier. Over the last decade, the cognitive scientists have undergone what Hutik and colleagues call a predictive turn. It's a growing recognition that the brain is not just reactive, but fundamentally predictive. And language too can be seen through this lens. And if the brain is a prediction machine, then linguistic systems must be shaped not only to convey information, but also to guide and constrain predictions. This is where nominal classification systems, grammatical gender, noun classes, and classifiers can become particularly interesting. On the surface, they may look redundant or arbitrary, but from a predictive perspective, their function becomes clearer. They provide early cues that help listeners anticipate upcoming words and meanings. So now let's have a look at the inquiry. So a number of studies have found that gender-marked articles and classifiers allow listeners to pre-activate following nouns. In French, there's a two-gender system, and gender is marked on articles in singular, but not in plural. Dahan and colleagues took advantage of this in an eye-tracking study, where listeners saw images like this, and then they would hear cliquez sur le, and that would result in looks to buttons as well as bottles. However, if they heard the singular cliquez sur le, then they did not look to bottles, they only looked to buttons. Bottles were eliminated from lexical competition because they take a different gender. And this paradigm with targets and distractors taking same or different articles and classifiers has been employed by researchers investigating other languages with gender-marked articles and classifiers. Our own contribution to this literature consists of a response time study of classifiers in Baniwa. Baniwa is an Arawakan language spoken in the Amazon, where Sandra has carried out field work over the past 5 years. So in the experiment, participants heard a phrase consisting of a, let's see if I have this one, consisting of a numeral, a classifier, and a noun. And then they would see two images, a target and a distractor. So here we have the target image. This is a snake, and the distractor, which was a path, which takes the same classifier. And below that we have the target, which is a snake, and a picture of a lemon, which takes a different classifier. So in the latter condition, lemon is not compatible with the classifier used for snake, whereas in the first condition it is. In the second case, the classifier can be used predictively, whereas in the first case, it cannot. Participants were then instructed to indicate which image the noun represented by clicking one of two keys on the keyboard. And we found that participants responded faster in the different condition. And that's sort of similar findings have been made in numerous languages such as Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, and Japanese. Another finding is that more constraining articles and classifiers are more predictively useful. More constraining here means that a classifier can be followed by a smaller and more restricted set of nouns, whereas less constraining classifiers can be followed by a wider set of nouns. So some studies have compared generic classifiers like Mandarin Chinese ge or Baniwa da to specific classifiers such as those encoding shape. But another way of looking at this is as a continuous spectrum. So for instance, for Baniwa, the least constraining classifier is da. Iwi, which is used for pointy reference, is somewhat more constraining. Api, used for hollow reference, less so, whereas the most constraining classifiers are those such as walia, which is only used for the word year. But overall, a consistent finding is that more constraining classifiers result in faster response times and faster fixations to the target in eye tracking studies. So here we have a plot from Klein et al. So on the x-axis we have time since noun onset in milliseconds, and on the y-axis we have proportion of looks. And they investigated Mandarin Chinese classifiers, the generic ge, and a specific shape classifier. And they found that there were more looks early on to the target when the classifier was specific. And this over here is from our study with Baniwa classifiers. So on the x-axis we have entropy, which is a measure of uncertainty or inverse constraint. And on the y-axis we have response time since noun onset in milliseconds. And this plot here shows that as constraint decreased, so did response times. We see the same pattern in neurocognitive studies when nouns are implausible continuations of classifiers. Then they result in larger N400 amplitudes. So the N400 is an ERP component, and it's stronger for less expected and more surprising words. It's often interpreted as a neural signature of semantic prediction error. And here we have data from Li and colleagues who looked at Mandarin Chinese classifiers. Here on the x-axis we have time in milliseconds, and on the y-axis we have microvolts. And they found that implausible noun continuations result in larger N400 amplitudes. Let's see if I can, that's the ones here. Whereas plausible noun continuations resulted in smaller N400 amplitudes. But also, and importantly, the N400 was modulated by the degree of constraint of the classifier, so that the strongly constraining classifiers followed by plausible nouns resulted in the smallest N400 amplitudes. And taken together, these findings show that classifiers actively shape expectations about upcoming nouns. So before we move on, let's just have a quick look at what this looks like for L2 speakers. So Lou Williams and Fennell again used this paradigm with same and different gender-marked articles. And they found that L1 adults as well as 3-year-old children do use classifiers or gender-marked articles predictably, as can be seen in these faster response times, whereas second language learners of Spanish didn't use them predictably at all. For classifiers, the story is slightly different. So Mitsuki found that second language learners of Japanese did use classifiers predictively, but they did so less efficiently than native speakers. And this difference between gender-marked articles and classifiers could have to do with the greater transparency of the classifiers. I should say here that in both cases, the speakers were sort of intermediate L2 learners. So to sum up, nominal classifications of systems of various kinds, like gender and classifiers, aid listeners in predicting upcoming nouns, which facilitates spoken language processing. We've looked at data from Mandarin Chinese and Baniwa, but this is further supported by studies on languages such as Norwegian and Vietnamese. An important caveat is that spoken language has a temporal dimension. Words arrive one after the other. And that means that articles and classifiers can only support prediction in languages where they precede the noun. That's the case in Baniwa, for instance, but it's not the case in Burmese. And in languages like Burmese, classifiers and articles, of course, cannot serve any predictive function. Here we have data from GramBank showing that in 43% of the world's languages, classifiers precede the nouns, and in an additional 13% of the languages, both words occur. So now we've seen that although nominal classification systems might seem redundant or arbitrary at first glance, they can serve important predictive functions. Gender and classifiers offer early cues that guide listeners' expectations about upcoming words and meanings. So that's an answer to the question of why do we have nominal classification systems at all? But then if they are so predictively useful, then why don't all languages have them? Next, we'll argue that nominal classification systems are useful for the listener, but that they may come at a cost for the speaker.
Yeah, so I will begin this segment by introducing the idea that efficiency in language is related to trade-offs between speaker and listener economy, which is an idea that has been put forth by many scholars. We'll illustrate it by Zipf's economy of words principle, where he describes speaker and listener economy as opposing forces. He argues that from a speaker economy point of view, the ideal language would just consist of one word, which would be a catch-all form that could mean anything the speaker wants it to mean. And that would be maximally efficient to learn and maintain, but it would be impossible to understand. So for the listener, the ideal would be the opposite, a language with a unique word for every concept, which ensures perfect clarity, but requires an enormous effort from the speaker. So obviously, natural languages fall somewhere in between these two opposites. And similar trade-offs have been proposed to operate both for language in general and at several linguistic levels. So when it comes to nominal classification, we suggest that there is a trade-off between listener benefit and speaker ease, such that in a language with nominal classification, the speaker has to make more of an effort, but this is compensated for by a relatively high listener benefit. While in a language without nominal classification, the listener doesn't get the same processing benefits, but on the other hand, the speaker doesn't need to make as much of an effort. But there's also sociolinguistic dimensions to this trade-off, and certain social contexts may favor one or the other outcome, which we also heard about in Professor Gaita's presidential address yesterday. So, for example, the processing advantages for listeners only outweigh the speaker disadvantages if the listener has sufficient command of the system. And in social contexts with many adult L2 users, the processing benefits may not be high enough to motivate the increased speaker effort. And therefore, we hypothesize that nominal classification is more common in languages with a smaller proportion of L2 users. And this is illustrated here by contrasting two types of speaker populations. So according to our hypothesis, there would be a higher likelihood for nominal classification systems in languages spoken in tight-knit communities with fewer L2 users, whereas there would be a lower likelihood of them in languages spoken in communities with looser ties and more L2 users. So just to see if there was anything to this idea, we did a preliminary study based on available data. So we used data from this study by Hjortdal, which says whether languages do or do not have nominal classification systems, and we combined that with some data from Ethnologue on L2 user proportions. And we were able to find data from both of these sources for 392 languages. 71% of them had a nominal classification system, so the sample is slightly skewed towards those compared to that more or less 50-50 split that we saw before. We analyzed the data in a hierarchical Bayesian model with area and genealogy as grouping variables and total users as a control variable. So the results were in line with our hypothesis. And the plot on the left is a density plot, where the x-axis shows the proportion of L2 speakers, and the y-axis shows the distribution of the data. You can see where the values are most concentrated. So the red ones are with nominal classification, and the green ones without. And in the plot on the right, the x-axis also shows the proportion of L2 users, and the y-axis shows the predicted probability of having a nominal classification system. So, as indicated by the wide credible intervals, there's some uncertainty around the effect, but there's an 89% probability that an increasing proportion of L2 speakers reduces the likelihood of having a nominal classification system. And one caveat that we would like to mention is that our data is a synchronic snapshot, which doesn't say so much about the historical L2 proportion of a language, which is of course relevant as it leads up to the current situation. A larger study taking more variables into account, such as historical data and the informativity of the systems would be needed in order to understand this better. And this is something we hope to do in the future. So to summarize, nominal classification systems exist in about half of the world's languages. They offer processing benefits for the listener, but come at a cost for the speaker. And a higher proportion of L2 users reduces the likelihood for a language to have a nominal classification system. And we have suggested that listener and speaker economy in tandem are important factors in predicting whether a language will or will not have a nominal classification system. Thank you.